If you are aware of maritime safety at sea, crew members and passengers on board modern ships would have navigation equipment to spot danger, such as a GPS and a radar. They would also announce danger by hearing 5 blasts of the horn. However, earlier liners like the RMS Titanic didn't have access to any equipment, and instead they had to rely on human eyesight, a telephone and a bell to look out and spot signs of danger. These jobs were assigned to a group of individuals who were known as lookouts. Lookouts were a group of individuals who would have worked on a ship's crow's nest, where they would scan the ocean for signs of danger, usually with binoculars. Each lookout would work in 2-hour shifts and would have taken 2 shifts a day, having 4 hours off duty. But the crow's nest would take 2 people at a time, so the lookouts were paired up together and they would remain in pairs throughout the entire voyage. The lookouts never had it easy on board, especially before the Titanic left Southampton. When the Titanic was docked in berth 44, it is believed that there had been a change in plans in the ranks, and this resulted in the dismissal of one officer, Second Officer David Blair. However, this dismissal was a misconception, as it was believed that when he left the Titanic, Blair took the keys to the cabinet for the binoculars that were thought to be inside. But according to the testimonies of George Simmons and Frederick Fleet, they said that the ship's binoculars were located in a box or a bag in the port after a corner inside the crow's nest. During every voyage on the White Star Line vessels and on other liner ships, lookouts were provided for them, but when the voyages were over, the binoculars would be handed back to the second officer. In the Titanic's case, the lookouts would have handed them back to Second Officer David Blair, but when Blair was dismissed, they would have been handed back to Second Officer Charles Lightoller. But when the Titanic left Southampton, Fleet said in the US inquiry that the lookouts knew that there were no binoculars. The reason why for this was that during the voyage, one pair of binoculars was on the bridge, and this pair was for the ship's senior officers and the commander. However, in the British inquiry, lookout George Hogg explained that in Belfast, he had a pair of binoculars on the Titanic's journey from Belfast to Southampton following her sea trials. When the ship was in Southampton, Hogg requested access to them, but he was denied since the whereabouts were unknown. Despite this, the binoculars wouldn't have made a difference, and even if they were used, they would be impossible to spot the iceberg. In conclusion to both inquiries, the International Ice Patrol was founded in 1914 to alert any sea vessel of icebergs. The patrol is still in operation today, and it is run by the US Coast Guard. When the wreck of the Titanic was discovered in 1985, the crow's nest was seen intact, but 3 years later it had vanished from the mast. However, the crow's nest bell was one of the first artifacts that was recovered from the debris field. Despite the history and responsibilities that were carried out in the crow's nest during the Titanic's maiden voyage, the lives of the ship's lookouts were tragic. On board, there were 6 lookouts, and all of them survived the sinking. In this video, we look into the lives and the careers of the lookouts of the RMS Titanic. Alfred Evans. Alfred Evans had an interesting career at sea, though his full life is a mystery. The surviving records we have of him were at sea and the ships he worked on. According to the records before the Titanic, he enrolled in the Royal Navy Reserve in 1906 and served as an able-bodied seaman on the RMS Oceanic between October 1911 and March 1912. After serving on the Oceanic, Evans signed on to the Titanic on the 6th of April. On the night of the disaster, Evans was on duty with another lookout, George Hogg. Both men were on watch between 6 and 8 p.m. When the Titanic collided with the Iceberg, Evans was in bed and instantly felt the impact. Immediately, he and Hogg went forward to the forecastle to investigate. At midnight of the 15th, both men relieved Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee from their shifts, and the two men in the crow's nest remained for around 20 minutes before they headed out to the boat deck. When he was on the boat deck, Evans helped to lower lifeboat number 7 and manned the forward falls. He survived the disaster when he entered into lifeboat 15. Following the sinking, Evans worked in the Southampton dockyards and made several voyages on the Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic. He later sailed on the HMS Victory during the First World War, and in the 1920s he returned to work in the Harland and Wolff's Southampton shipyards. He didn't return to sea after he had his application rejected due to heart disease. Frederick Fleet. The most infamous lookout of the Titanic disaster, Frederick Fleet is famous for saying the line "Iceberg right ahead." Although he is only featured for saying the line in the media, Fleet's life is a tragic one, as he was abandoned by his mother, raised in orphanages, and later with foster families and distant relatives. Fleet began his career at sea in 1903 when he began working as a deck boy before working up to able seaman. In 1908, Fleet began working on board the Oceanic before he signed on to the Titanic in 1912. On the night of the disaster, Fleet and Reginald Lee relieved Archie and George Simmons at 10 p.m. Before their shift, Simmons advised Fleet and Lee to keep a sharp lookout for small ice. At 11:39 p.m, Fleet saw a black mass ahead. Immediately he struck 7 bells and telephoned the bridge. After 6th Officer Moody picked up the telephone, Fleet cried, "Are you there?" When Officer Moody asked, "Yes, what do you see?" Fleet cried the infamous words, "Iceberg, right ahead." While he was still on the telephone, Fleet saw the collision between the Titanic and the Iceberg on the ship's starboard side. Fleet and Lee saw ice falling on the decks. 20 minutes later, both Fleet and Lee were relieved by Alfred Evans and George Hogg. In the middle of the sinking, Second Officer Charles Lightoller asked him to help Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to load and launch Lifeboat number 6. He later went into the same lifeboat before it was picked up by the RMS Carpathia at 6 a.m, after spending nearly 5 hours inside the lifeboat. Following the sinking, Fleet was questioned in the American, British, and Ryan inquiries. Later on in his life, Fleet served briefly as a seaman on the Olympic before leaving the White Star Line in August 1912. Despite this, he sailed with Union Castle and various other companies for 24 years before changing careers, including working as a shipbuilder for the same company that built the Titanic, Harland and Wolff, which had a location in Southampton. There will be a full-length video of Fleet's life in a future video. George Hogg. Before the sinking, George Hogg had a 13-year career at sea as a seaman, a boatswain's mate, a quartermaster and a lookout. He had worked for several shipping lines, including P&O, Royal Mail and Union Castle, before joining the White Star Line. Hogg signed on to the Titanic after he had finished travelling on the P&O steamship, the Dongola. After signing on, Hogg joined the ship in Belfast and travelled down to Southampton. On the night of the disaster, Hogg and Alfred Evans were preparing to relieve Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee for their 2-hour watch. Hogg was asleep when the collision took place, but he didn't hear or feel the impact. A little while later, he saw a rush of people going up to the forecastle and knew that something didn't feel right. An unknown seaman told Hogg what happened before he and Evans began their night shift. 20 minutes later, the pair saw that the situation had escalated when they saw people putting their lifebelts on from above the crow's nest. Hogg attempted to telephone the bridge, but he was unsuccessful. He then went to the boat deck to help uncover the lifeboats before he was instructed to get the Jacob's ladder ready. And as a other note, the term Jacob's ladder is another name for rope ladder. Afterwards, Hogg was approached by First Officer William Murdoch to check lifeboat number 7 and then was ordered to get in to take charge of the boat. Assisted by Archie and able-bodied seaman William Weller, the lifeboat was lowered at around 12:45 a.m. Occupants in Lifeboat 7 were picked up at 6:15 a.m. by the Carpathia. Later on, Hogg was detained in New York before being questioned at the U.S. Enquiry, where he gave details on his encounters on the Titanic and the maximum number of people who were on board Lifeboat 7. Upon his return, he was then questioned at the British Enquiry into the disaster. Following the Titanic, Hogg went on to continue to serve for the White Star Line and would work on the RMS Olympic and the RMS Majestic. Archie Jewell. Going to work at sea from the age of 15, Archie Jewell joined the White Star Line in 1904. During his time with the shipping line, he served on board the RMS Oceanic for nearly 10 years before he transferred to the Titanic for her maiden voyage. On the night of the disaster, Jewell was in his berth when the ship struck the Iceberg. Jewell left the ship in lifeboat number 7 alongside one of the other lookouts, George Hogg. Unlike Hogg, who was detained in New York, Jewell arrived back in England in late April 1912, but he was detained overnight at Plymouth by the British Board of Trade. Jewell was then called to testify at the British Inquiry into the disaster. He became the first witness to be questioned, and he was thanked for his cooperation. After Titanic, Jewell went on to sail the Titanic's sister ship, the HMHS Britannic, and survived the sinking in 1916. Jewell left the White Star Line and served on board his last ship, the Midland Railway Line's ship, the SS Donegal, as an abled seaman. Tragically, the SS Donegal was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank within the English Channel. Jewell died in the sinking. Like Frederick Fleet, there will be a future video on Archie Jewell. Reginald Lee. Another infamous lookout, Reginald Lee was famous for seeing the Iceberg collision alongside Frederick Fleet on the night of the disaster. Before the Titanic in 1887, Lee had joined the British Royal Navy working as a clerk before being promoted to paymaster. However, in the late 1890s, Lee developed a serious drinking problem, and this was mentioned in the Navy's records, as Lee was discharged in 1900 and was placed on the retired list with only a payment of £200. Following this, Lee joined the White Star Line, where he served as a lookout on board the RMS Olympic. In 1912, Lee signed on to the Titanic in Southampton. On the night of the disaster, Lee and Fleet were in the middle of their 2-hour shift above the crow's nest, where Lee took up his position on the starboard side. While looking out from the crow's nest, Lee said that before he and Fleet spotted the iceberg, a haze had developed in the North Atlantic Ocean. However, since the sea was pitch black, the lookouts wouldn't have been able to see a thing until it was too late. Helplessly watching the events unfold, Lee saw the Titanic turning to port before the ship struck the iceberg. Fleet mentioned years later that prior to the impact, Lee briefly fled inside the crow's nest as he was terrified they would hit it much closer. At midnight on the 15th, Lee and Fleet descended from the crow's nest, and Lee went on to the seaman's mess room on sea deck. There, he saw water coming into the compartment through a tarpaulin, and soon saw firemen and greasers coming up from their quarters to escape from the rising water. When he arrived on the boat deck, Lee remained on the starboard side and was assigned to Lifeboat 11, but because Lifeboat 11 was full, 6th Officer Moody helped him at Lifeboat 13. Lee then jumped into the lifeboat alongside leading firemen Frederick Barrett, the Cardwell family, and Lawrence Beasley. Lifeboat 13 almost didn't make it into the water as Lifeboat 15 nearly landed on top of the occupants in 13. Luckily, everyone in Lifeboat 13 survived. Lee was stood at the helm of the lifeboat, and although he didn't see the Titanic making her final plunge, he did hear some of the underwater explosions. Upon his return to Britain, Lee testified in the British Inquiry and was questioned about the lack of binoculars in the crow's nest. Following the Titanic disaster, Lee continued working at sea until he returned to Southampton to live at the Sailors' Home. He died in 1913 from heart failure. George Simmons. Despite his life being a mystery, George Simmons had previously worked on the White Star liner, the Oceanic, as a lookout before he signed on to the Titanic in April 1912. When he boarded the Titanic, Simmons, who was interested in where the binoculars were, said that during the inquiries that after the Titanic left Southampton, he went to the officers' mess room and asked for them. In response, Second Officer Charles Lightoller said, "Simmons, there are none." There are no records on what happened, but it was reported that Simmons was put in command of Lifeboat Number 1, which only carried 12 people on board. The events in this lifeboat were well documented, and it was all because of Simmons' testimonies in both inquiries. This subject will later be included in a future video. Following the sinking, Simmons returned to Britain and continued to work at sea. Although the stories of Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee are well known, the lives of the other lookouts have been overshadowed and overlooked. But seeing their actions from that night, one has to argue the reliability of the men and the roles they had played during the disaster.